my beautiful people. I'm not sure how many people would relate to this particular subject I'm getting into, but I don't care. It's my channel and I do what I want with it. So this is another episode of Is K-pop That Deep, which is an ongoing series on my channel, ironically talking about the deeper psychological and sociological parts of the genre. I thought I'd figure talk about something that has been buzzing in the industry in the past year, labor rights. Labor rights have actually been progressing a lot as of late, such as the WGA strike in Hollywood, Starbucks unionizing their stores, etc. People want fair wages and fair treatment, and it took a whole pandemic for people to give a shit about their second home. Sure, labor rights aren't necessarily the hottest thing to talk about. Hell, I could talk more about Jungkook's abs or the fact that these gems use the fucking clothes. But I think it's important to talk about social issues on this channel as well, and what better way to start it with what I know the most outside of knowing too much about K-pop. Labor unions do exist in Korea. In fact, the first union was created under Japanese rule in 1910, and since then there has been a few movements here and there to unionize some industries, with the most recent protests happening during the COVID pandemic. The K-pop industry is known for being pretty cutthroat, and many Western outlets love talking about the dark side of K-pop. But I wanted to humanize these stories a bit and show the direction of where labor rights is going since the second generation idols. So, slave contracts have been a part of the industry since the very beginning, but the first instance of this being an issue was in July 2008 with CHUU. Originally a 5-member group, Jaejoon, Yuchun, and Jinsu all filed a lawsuit against SM Entertainment for the long contracts and unfair compensation. This created a huge wave of shock to many fans and beyond, as TVXQ was at the height of their popularity after the release of the classic banger Melodic. This is also after the first generation idols had declined in popularity as they got older, so this was like a really big scandal that rocked the K-pop world in its caliber, that we saw a glimpse of what these slave contracts are about. The contract that SM has signed for the group was a whopping 13 years, and some of the members were paid more than others. Now, as you guys know, SM is not really a good guy in this instance, as the trio was sued for a breach of contract after they went to another company, Avex. This was pretty nasty, but the trio ended up winning the lawsuit and continue as a trio as JYJ, of course, only to be blacklisted from performing on music shows, variety shows, and pretty much everything until the recent years. But nonetheless, JYJ still ended up being relatively successful in Japan, with all 5 members still being relatively loved despite what happened. EXO's lawsuits also show how incredibly messed up the foreign members' contracts were, with nearly everybody in that group who were Chinese descent except for Lay ended up suing SM to terminate their contracts. Luhan, Chris, and Tao ended up suing in order to do promotional solo activities in their home country, with Tao specifically suing after withstanding injuries from all the stunts he did for EXO. All of them were able to leave SM effectively, but Tao was still sued for promoting until 2018 when the court ruled against his favor. I think these 2 lawsuit eras really show how litigious entertainments can be. They could really stop at nothing to ruin someone's life, which I generally believe that's way too much power for a corporation to have. I think if we were to look at how cartoonishly evil a company is, we look no further than Omega X and their company Spire. This company has a CEO who was an older woman, probably old enough to be someone's grandma, who was verbally abusing these members in a hotel room. It turned out this happened quite regularly, and the group was constantly touring and doing fan calls in between these tour dates. There was even a time when the company straight up stranded the group somewhere during their world tour, and then the members and the members' families literally had to pitch in to pay for their flights back to Korea. There were also allegations of them having to perform while having COVID, and even some of the members were SA'd when they were at drinking events in order for them to make music. You'd think that these things were of the past now, that we're in 2023, but unfortunately this happens in today's 4th generation idol groups. What is incredibly awesome, though, is the fact that Omega X was able to speak their fans to social media by creating their own accounts and speaking the truth. I think for earlier generation groups, this was not possible because of how incredibly strict things were back then, but now, groups are able to talk about struggles quite loudly to their fans. With how dedicated K-pop fans can be, they will support them no matter what. Now, the group has left Spire and terminated their contracts with them. Just earlier this week, they were able to join a new company with a full group intact, which I think is honestly really beautiful. However, this isn't all sunshine and rainbows. We'll still have the drama in 2023 with 50/50, a group that's being fought over by the company Attract and the Givers, a producing group created by camp employees. Yes, it's that camp that you're thinking of. Basically what happened was that Camp and Attract came together to create the 50 project, a project that ended up creating the group 50/50. Camp ended up pulling out altogether after some evaluations, but 3 employees from Camp ended up becoming a part of the Givers, a producing group. The Givers was actually the group that ended up buying Cupid from some Swedish music students for $9,000 so they can make Cupid, well, Korean and K-pop-y. The song ended up being a success, and the Givers ended up having a really good relationship with the group to the point where the girls sued to terminate a contract from Attract, claiming they were misled the whole time what was going on behind the scenes. Now, the story is developing as we speak, but basically it boils down to 2 parties who are trying to get a piece of the pie from 50/50 success, all the while damaging the girls' chances with them pulling out with the music video for the Barbie soundtrack to pulling out of KCON, which is actually meant to be their international debut. I find it really nuts that the group had to be held hostage in this way, but this provides a good insight of how much a company can sabotage a group if they wanted to. However, one cannot talk about labor rights in K-pop without talking about the infamous LOONA, the 12-member girl group with the most unhinged but passionate fandom. Here's a breakdown of how the LOONA boycott happened by Orbit oral historian Bert.
Background information. Blockberry Creative, also known as BBC, this is the company that manages LOONA. LOONA, a 12-member girl group, according to the girls and the fans, that debuted in 2018. However, according to the company, they kicked member CHUU out in November of this year. LOONA had an extensive and expensive pre-debut project that spanned from 2016 to 2018, which gradually revealed the members of the group. Note, it was very expensive, and people were wondering, how is BBC paying for this? Well, they got into lots of debt. Because of this debt, none of the members, not even CHUU, who had been going on to do many brand deals and show appearances, were getting paid, which would eventually lead to CHUU filing a lawsuit against BBC in regards to her contract, and allegedly won. After CHUU's lawsuit, it became evident that BBC did not want this woman in the company. So her appearances began to dwindle down until she straight up disappeared, and then it was officially made clear that CHUU was kicked out of the group in November of this year. Shortly after CHUU was kicked out, it was reported that 9 of the 11 other members of LOONA also filed injunctions to get out of their contracts with BBC. Now, BBC denied this, but they had also denied that CHUU was leaving LOONA earlier, so we know not to trust BBC. To everyone's surprise, BBC has announced that LOONA will be coming back on January 3rd, 2023, despite it being clear that the girls do not want to be in the company anymore. Now, if it hasn't already been spelled out for you, why should you not support this comeback in any way, shape, or form? The members are not getting paid for their work, and likely will never be paid for their work. All funds that go towards this comeback will go to the company to give the company leverage against the girls who are trying to leave. Even if you don't stan LOONA, heck, even if you're not a K-pop stan at all, I'm sure many of you can empathize with wanting people to get proper dues for their work. So join us in boycotting. The least you can do is do nothing and not support it at all.
The boycott ended up being so successful that the comeback ended up being canceled completely, and the girls were able to leave Blockberry with the full support Orbits. It shows how incredibly powerful the fandom can be if they get behind a cause that supports the group as a whole, even if it means they could potentially risk losing the group altogether if failed. So why do idols need a union? What exactly is a union anyway? According to Oxford Dictionary, a union is an organized association of workers formed to protect their rights and interests. This usually means higher wages, better working conditions, and a proper process to complain about your employer, things like that. As y'all can already tell, there's a lot of mistreatment that happens within the entertainment industry. The industry is special in the sense that everyone works off of their contracts for a number of years. This is different from the single employer type of job where you're for sure going to work for the company as long as you want to or until you quit or get fired. So idols are temporary employees that don't have much work experience outside being a trainee, which puts them in a trap basically. This paired with the confusion, work ethic that Koreans and all Asians really have creates a recipe to exploit the fuck out of idols. I'm not saying that Asians got it bad because the issue here is really just capitalism, but the idea that hard work would mean success is ingrained in these idols to the point where they would work through injuries and mental health crises because, well, they gotta quote-unquote work harder in order to succeed in this cutthroat industry. This is probably why idols aren't open to unions initially, because most people who aren't well acquainted with unions would find it irritating to talk to a quote-unquote outsider about their problems and having to wait for things to change. However, studies have consistently shown that a union does provide better wages and working conditions for those who join, as well as the overall company satisfaction, because there's always someone in your orbit who's willing to help you from your circumstances. Not all unions are perfect though, and since there is only one association right now in Korea, idols have to do a lot of groundwork to organize and create unions. This requires a lot of energy and effort, which, since these idols work 13 to 15-hour days, is very likely that they have the time or energy to organize. Although I wouldn't be surprised if it happens in the future, because if JB and GOT7 studied law to get him and his group out of JYP, then anybody can probably organize a union. I guess the biggest question is, whenever there's a boycott occurring, what can we actually do as fans? What can we actually do as fans in this industry, and how can we support our favorite artists in the midst of them fighting for their livelihoods? Since most of us don't live in Korea, there's a limit of what we can do in terms of notifying legislators, but I think it's important for us to be able to effectively boycott until things are changed. I don't see this happen as effectively as often besides the LOONA boycott, but it has for bigger fandoms, because with bigger fandoms, it tends to be an argument of whether or not boycotts would do anything. It would, because of differing ideologies. But I believe that being able to convince enough people to boycott is going to significantly make a difference. It would help to work with the Korean fan community on this by standing in solidarity by not purchasing albums or merch for the upcoming comeback or tour. For example, I have personally been boycotting HYBE's dynamic pricing for tours by purchasing only directly from Hantel certified stores and buying fan-made merch instead of what's going on Weverse, which personally I find is a lot better in quality than official stuff. Unfortunately, the language that companies talk about is money and profit. If we take these things away by fighting the urge to not spend on these items, these things would have to be done. In terms of, well, what about the artists? How can they get paid if we don't support them? That's the thing. They're not getting paid through this contract anyways. We can encourage them to seek legal advice and find labor rights activists to help explain this further. I think it would be beneficial if someone who's well-versed in Korean labor rights can do explainer threads for the fandom so they can understand in layman terms as to what's going on as well. Honestly, the most important thing is to listen to the Korean fans. As much as some of y'all hate domestic fans, they tend to know a lot more than what they lead on to protect the group, and some of them have been there since pre-debut. I think it's key to read their demands and uphold it rather than laughing it off or finding it trivial when it's something as serious as mistreatment and better pay. Hell, the Free Britney campaign began what looked like a bunch of conspiracy theories, and we ended up having a whole trial in which Britney was indeed in a very abusive conservatorship and ended up getting out of it. Not all complaints are quote-unquote man-type behavior, a term that is their term to describe manager fans who don't believe that the members have any autonomy and infantilize them. Hell, I don't believe that advocating for better working conditions is considered man-type behavior. Everyone can benefit from artists from being happier to work as they're more creative and excited to see their fans, and to dismiss this as man-type talk is extremely incredibly ignorant. Yes, K-pop idols are adults, but yes, these systems are exploitative in nature as well. They're hyper-capitalistic in nature, and corporations are not your friend. I'm looking at you, armies.
How good are you at the work-life balance?
Oh, I don't like that concept, work-life balance. Actually, I always say work-life harmony. 저는 사실 삶하고 이 워크랑 라이프 밸런스라고 얘기하면 마치 노동이 삶의 적같이 느껴지는 게 너무 싫어서 사실 워크라이프 밸런스란 말을 잘 쓰지 않거든요.
Anyways. Even Jin, a member of BTS, had this to say about speaking up about what he wanted to do for enlistment.
그러면은 진 네가 당당하게 회사가 뭐라고 하든 네가 당당하게 가겠습니다 하면 되는 거 아니냐 이랬는데, 아유 저도 비정규직으로 일을 하고 있지 않습니까? 그리고 저희는 이제 7명이 하나인데 저도 이제 회사랑 다시 재계약도 해야 되고 뭐 밑보여서 뭐합니까? 회사랑 원하는 좋은 방향으로 얘기를 해야죠. 제가 갑자기 뜬금없이 저 가요 이래버리면 회사에서 엥? 저희 안 이러기로 했잖아요 이러면 이제 회사에서 재계약할 때 너 그때 그랬잖아 이러면 또 어떡합니까? 곤란하잖아요. 저도 앞으로도 더 열심히 일하고 그래야 되는데. 네.
It speaks volumes even if Jin in fucking BTS knows how this industry works and how temporary it all is. For those who don't necessarily know how the business works, every single person is signed under a contract and they're not really obligated to be a part of that company for the entire duration of their career. They have to wait until if the company wants to renew their contract or not. Meaning that at any point in time, people can renew their contracts or not renew their contracts with the company they work for. He puts his members first, which I think is important at the end of the day when it comes to strikes. It's all because of the members, the group that you choose to stand and support. If it bothers you in any way to not give money to companies that use our money to do evil things, it shouldn't be truly. Because guess what? Groups deserve happiness too, and corporations are not going to make them happy. Like, don't make me tap the sign. There's a reason as to why the writer's strike is still persisting, and the SAG soon to join them after. Strikes are meant to be disruptive and interrupt the flow of things in order for people to gather at the table and bargain. In fact, as our dear friend Bert would say,
Y'all, boycotts and protests, they work!
it does work if people cooperate. This is why Korean shovels and armies are able to change the venues of Chinese fan meetings and BTS's free concert respectively. We all have voices that we can use to make a change, and by not speaking up, you are a part of the problem. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you're really here for social issues and don't want to perform performative activism, please do something and support boycotts when they appear. Doing nothing actually helps more than pretending to say that you care. And that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and hope to see you in the next one.